If the person you trusted most suddenly destroyed your life without explanation, would you still believe they had a reason? Emily Carter didn't have time to answer that question as the glass doors of Brooks Industries slid open and two security guards walked straight toward her desk, while every head in the office slowly turned, the clicking of heels and the hum of computers fading into a heavy silence that made her chest tighten. Just 10 minutes ago, she had been reviewing a client report, sipping lukewarm coffee, thinking about picking up her 6-year-old son from daycare on time for once, and now those same coworkers who once smiled at her were staring like she had become a stranger overnight. "Miss Carter, please come with us," one of the guards said calmly, not unkind, but firm enough to make it clear this wasn't optional, and Emily felt her fingers go cold as she stood up, her chair scraping lightly against the floor, her heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the whispers beginning to ripple across the room. She glanced instinctively toward the corner office with the floor-to-ceiling windows, toward the man who had changed everything for her just 3 months ago. Daniel Brooks, CO, 39, known for being sharp, distant, and impossible to impress. He was already standing there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable, watching her. This was the same man who had given her a job when she had nothing but a worn resume and a desperate hope. The same man who had looked past the fact that she was a single mom struggling to pay rent on a small 2-bedroom apartment. The same man who had once told her in a quiet voice, "I don't care where you came from, Emily. I care what you can do." And she had believed him, not because she was naive, but because for the first time in years, someone in power had treated her like she mattered. The guards guided her forward, and each step felt heavier than the last, like she was walking into something she didn't understand yet. Her mind racing through every possibility. Had she made a mistake, missed an email, misunderstood a deadline? But nothing explained the tension in the room or the way people avoided her eyes. Then she heard it, a voice from behind, low but sharp. "I knew it." And another whisper, she was too close to him. And suddenly the air felt thinner. Emily stopped just a few feet from Daniel, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay steady. "What's going on?" And for a split second, something flickered in his eyes, something almost human, but it vanished so quickly she wondered if she imagined it. "You've been identified as the source of a data breach involving confidential client information," he said, his tone even, controlled, like he was reading a line he had practiced, and the words hit her like cold water, leaving her stunned, her thoughts scattering. "That's not possible," she said immediately, shaking her head, her voice rising just enough to carry across the silent office. "I would never." But he cut her off with a slight raise of his hand, not harsh, just final. "The evidence has been reviewed," he continued, "and effective immediately. Your employment is terminated." And just like that, in a matter of seconds, everything she had rebuilt began to collapse again. Emily looked at him, really looked this time, searching for anything, a hint of doubt, a sign he didn't believe what he was saying, but his face remained composed, distant, almost cold, and that hurt more than the accusation itself, because just hours earlier, she had overheard something she couldn't shake, his voice through the partially open conference room door, calm but deliberate. "She's perfect for this plan," and at the time, she thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally trusting her with something bigger, something that meant she had proven herself, but now standing here, with security at her side and judgment in every eye around her, that sentence echoed differently, darker, like a piece of a puzzle she didn't want to complete. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, not pleading, just stating what she believed to be true, but Daniel didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't even look away. He simply nodded once to the guards, and that was it, the signal that ended her place. In this building, in this life she had fought so hard to rebuild. As they led her toward the exit, Emily felt the weight of every step, every whisper, every stare, but just before she crossed the threshold, she turned back one last time, and in that brief moment, she saw it again, that flicker in Daniel's eyes, not anger, not disappointment, but something deeper, something that didn't match the role he was playing, and it left her with a question she couldn't answer, one that would follow her long after those doors closed behind her, because if he really believed she betrayed him, Why did it look like he was the one carrying the burden of the decision? The silence outside the building felt louder than everything that had just happened inside, as if the city itself had paused to let the weight of the moment settle on Emily Carter's shoulders. And for a few seconds, she simply stood there on the sidewalk, her hands still trembling, her mind trying to catch up with a reality that made no sense. People walked past her without noticing. Cars moved in steady lines down the street, and somewhere in the distance a siren echoed faintly, but none of it felt real, not after what had just happened. She had just been fired, publicly, accused of something she did not do, by the one person she believed would at least listen to her. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to move, because standing still made everything feel heavier. And as she walked away from the glass building that once represented a second chance, her thoughts began to rewind, searching for anything she might have missed. It had not always been like this, and that was what made it harder to accept. 3 months ago, she had walked into that same building with nothing but determination and quiet desperation, her savings barely enough to cover 2 weeks of rent, her son asking questions she could not always answer, and every rejection email slowly chipping away at her confidence. When she first sat across from Daniel Brooks in that interview room, she remembered thinking he would dismiss her within minutes, his posture straight, his gaze sharp, his reputation already intimidating before he even spoke. But he did not interrupt her, did not rush her, and when she finished explaining her situation, there was a brief silence before he leaned back slightly and said, "You are not the most experienced candidate, but you are the most honest one." And that sentence had stayed with her longer than anything else. He gave her the job, not out of pity, but because he saw something she had almost forgotten in herself. From that moment on, Emily worked harder than she ever had, arriving early, staying late, learning every system, every process, every detail she could, because this was not just a job, it was stability, it was dignity, it was the chance to build something better for her son. And over time, something unexpected happened. Daniel began to notice. It started with small things, brief acknowledgments in meetings, then responsibilities others at her level did not usually get. Until one day he called her into his office and handed her a file that made her pause. "I need someone I can trust with this," he said, his tone steady but direct, and she felt a quiet sense of pride rise in her chest, not because of the task itself, but because of what it meant. Trust was not something Daniel Brooks gave easily, and everyone in the office knew it. But with that trust came attention, and not all of it was positive. Whispers began to form, subtle at first, then more noticeable, co-workers exchanging looks, conversations stopping when she walked into a room, assumptions being made without words being spoken. Emily tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, telling herself that results would speak louder than rumors. But deep down, she could feel the shift. Then came the moment she could not stop replaying. Earlier that same day, when she passed by the conference room and heard Daniel's voice through the slightly open door, calm and precise. "She is perfect for this plan." And she had paused, just for a second, her heart lifting in a way she did not expect, thinking maybe this was another opportunity. Something bigger, something that would prove she truly belonged. She did not hear the rest of the conversation, and now that missing piece felt like everything. As she reached the corner of the street, Emily stopped again, her thoughts colliding, because nothing added up, not the accusation, not the evidence he claimed to have, not the way he looked at her in that final moment. Daniel Brooks was many things, but careless was not one of them. And if he truly believed she had done something wrong, he would have confronted her directly, privately, not turned it into a public scene. That was not his style, and she knew that better than anyone. Which meant there were only two possibilities. Either he had completely misjudged her, or there was something else happening beneath the surface, something she was not supposed to see. And as that realization settled in, a new feeling began to replace the shock, not anger, not even fear, but a quiet, determined need to understand the truth. Because if there was one thing Emily Carter refused to accept, it was being defined by something she did not do, especially not by someone who once saw her clearly. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone, her reflection faintly visible on the dark screen, and for a moment she hesitated, her thumb hovering, because whatever came next would change everything again. But this time, She would not be the one caught off guard. Emily Carter did not call anyone right away, even though every instinct told her to explain, to defend herself, to reach out to someone who might still believe in her, because deep down she knew this was not something that could be fixed with a simple conversation. Whatever had just happened inside that building was planned, precise, and far too controlled to be a misunderstanding. And as she stood on the corner with her phone in hand, one thought kept returning, sharper each time. If Daniel Brooks truly believed she had betrayed the company, why did his eyes look like he was holding something back? She slowly lowered the phone, slipping it back into her bag, and instead turned her attention to something else, something small but important: the timeline. Everything had started to shift after that conversation she overheard. The one sentence that now felt like a warning she failed to understand. She is perfect for this plan. And the more she replayed it, the more it did not sound like praise anymore. It sounded like positioning. Emily began walking again, this time with more focus, her steps quicker, her thoughts organizing themselves into something more deliberate. Because if she had been used, then there had to be a reason, and more importantly, there had to be someone else involved. She reached a quiet coffee shop a few blocks away, the kind of place she used to stop by before work when she needed a moment to breathe. And as she stepped inside, the familiar smell of coffee and soft background music grounded her just enough to think clearly. She chose a corner table, setting her bag down and pulling out her phone again, but this time not to call anyone. Instead, she opened her email, scrolling through recent messages, looking for anything unusual, anything she might have overlooked in the rush of her daily tasks. At first, everything looked normal: client updates, internal memos, scheduling confirmations. But then something caught her attention: a file she had sent late the previous night, a routine report she had double-checked before submitting. Yet now, as she opened the sent version, something felt off. Her eyes moved carefully across the data, line by line, and within seconds her stomach tightened, because the numbers were not the same. Subtle changes, small enough that someone not paying attention might miss them, but significant enough to alter the entire report's meaning. Emily leaned back slightly, her heart beginning to race again, because she knew exactly what this meant. The file had been altered after she sent it, and if that version was the one being used as evidence against her, then someone had deliberately made it look like she was responsible. She quickly checked the timestamp, comparing it with her own records, and the gap confirmed it. There had been access to her work after she completed it. A quiet realization settled in, heavier than anything she had felt before. This was not just a misunderstanding. This was a setup. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying herself, because the implications were clear. Someone inside the company had both the access and the intention to frame her. And if Daniel was involved, then nothing about this situation was as simple as it appeared. But then another thought surfaced, one that made her hesitate. What if he was not the one behind it? What if he was reacting to something he believed was real, something that had been manipulated just as carefully as this report? Emily opened her eyes again, her gaze focused now, sharper, because there was only one way to move forward. She needed to find the original source of the breach, not just to clear her name, but to understand why she had been chosen. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag, something she always carried, and began writing down everything she could remember, every project she had worked on, every file she had accessed, every person who might have had reason to notice her growing role in the company. And as she wrote, a pattern slowly began to form, not complete, not yet clear, but enough to suggest that this was not random. Emily Carter had been placed in the center of something much larger than a single accusation. And as she looked down at the list in front of her, one name stood out more than the others, not because it was obvious, but because it was the only one that did not fit. The only one connected to both her recent work and the quiet tension she had felt in the office days before everything fell apart. She stared at it for a moment, her grip tightening slightly on the pen, because if she was right, then the truth was closer than she thought, and at the same time, far more dangerous to uncover than she had ever imagined. The name on Emily Carter's notebook did not look suspicious at first glance, which was exactly what made it impossible to ignore, because everything about the situation so far had been designed to appear normal until it was too late. She stared at it for several seconds, her mind replaying every interaction she had with that person, every meeting, every shared document, every moment that once felt routine but now carried a different weight. It was not the loudest voice in the room, not the one who openly questioned her, but someone quieter, someone who had always been present without drawing attention, someone who knew exactly where to be and when. Emily tapped the pen lightly against the table, her thoughts sharpening as the pieces began to connect in a way that felt both unsettling and undeniable. This person had access, not just to her work, but to the systems that tracked it, which meant altering files, shifting timestamps, and redirecting attention would not only be possible, it would be easy if done carefully. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice even though no one around her was paying attention, as if speaking the realization out loud might somehow make it more real. It was never about the report, she whispered to herself, because the report was just the surface, the visible part of something deeper, something planned. The question was not just who changed the file, but why it had to be her, why she was chosen to take the fall. And as she thought about that, her memory returned again to Daniel Brooks, to the way he had said those words earlier. She is perfect for this plan. And suddenly, for the first time, the possibility shifted in her mind. What if that statement was not about using her as a scapegoat, but about placing her in a position where something else could unfold? Emily sat back, her heart beating faster, because this changed everything. If Daniel knew more than he showed, then his silence was not indifference, it was intention. But that did not answer the most important question. Was he protecting the company, or was he protecting her? She reached for her phone again, scrolling through her messages, stopping at one contact she had not considered calling until now. Someone from the IT department. Someone who once helped her recover a corrupted file late one evening when she was still new and trying to prove herself. His name was Ryan Mitchell, and he had always been straightforward. The kind of person who noticed details others missed, but rarely spoke unless necessary. Emily hesitated for a moment, because reaching out meant taking a step she could not undo. But then she reminded herself of what was at stake. Not just her job, but her reputation, her future, and the stability she had fought to build for her son. She pressed the call button, holding the phone to her ear as it rang once, then twice, each second stretching longer than it should, until finally a familiar voice answered, slightly cautious. Emily. And she exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in focus. Because this conversation needed to be careful, precise. I need your help, she said, keeping her tone steady. I think something in the system has been altered, and I need to know how it could have happened. There was a brief pause on the other end, not long, but enough to signal that he understood the weight behind her words. That depends, Ryan replied, lowering his voice instinctively. On who had access? And Emily glanced down at her notebook, at the name she had written, the one that no longer felt like a coincidence. Someone who should not have needed it, she said quietly, and the silence that followed was heavier this time, filled with implications neither of them needed to say out loud. Meet me, Ryan finally said, his tone more serious now. Not at the office, and Emily nodded even though he could not see her, because she already knew why, whatever this was. It was not something that could be discussed where records were kept and conversations could be traced. As she ended the call, she felt the shift inside her again. Not fear, not uncertainty, but something more controlled, more deliberate, because for the first time since everything fell apart, she was no longer reacting, she was moving forward. But even as that determination settled in, one thought lingered, quiet but persistent. Because if she was beginning to uncover the truth, then it meant one thing above all else. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she would never find it. And that meant she was already deeper into this than she had ever intended to be. Ryan Mitchell chose a place that made sense the moment Emily Carter saw it. A small 24-hour diner just off the highway where truck drivers came and went without paying attention to anyone else. The kind of place where conversations blended into background noise and no one asked questions. She arrived a few minutes early, sliding into a booth near the back, her eyes scanning the room out of habit now, not fear exactly, but awareness, because once you realize you have been part of something you did not understand, you stop assuming anything is random. When Ryan walked in, he did not wave or call her name. He simply nodded slightly as he approached and sat across from her. His posture relaxed, but his eyes focused, the same way she remembered from the office when he was solving a problem no one else could see. "You picked a good place," she said quietly, and he gave a small shrug. "Less chance of anyone listening who knows what we are talking about," he replied, glancing briefly around before leaning forward just enough to lower his voice. "Now tell me everything." And Emily did, not rushing, not skipping details, because she understood now that the smallest piece of information could change everything. She explained the altered report, the timestamps that did not match, the accusation, the way Daniel handled it, and most importantly, the sentence she overheard earlier that day. Ryan listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive, and when she finished, he exhaled slowly, as if confirming something in his own mind. "You are right about one thing," he said, his tone measured. "Files do not just change like that, not without leaving a trace, unless someone knows exactly how to avoid it." Emily felt her chest tighten slightly. "So it was intentional," she said, more statement than question, and Ryan nodded once. "Very intentional," he replied, then paused briefly before adding, "And whoever did it has high-level access, or at least knows how to move through the system like they do." Emily glanced down at her notebook, at the name she had written earlier, then looked back up at him. "Can you check?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying the weight of what she was asking. Because this was not just a favor, this was risk. Ryan did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly as he considered it. "If I access the logs directly, it might flag something," he said. "But there are ways to look without triggering alerts. It just takes time." Emily leaned forward slightly. "Then we do it carefully," she said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the decision had already been made. Ryan reached into his jacket, pulling out a small tablet, not the standard company-issued device, but something personal, something not directly tied to the network they were discussing. And as he powered it on, his movements were precise, efficient, the kind that came from experience. "I cannot access everything from here," he explained, "but I can start with external logs, anything that passed through the system from outside." Sources. Emily watched closely, not because she understood every detail, but because she needed to see that this was real, that there was something concrete beneath all the uncertainty. Minutes passed, the quiet hum of the diner filling the space between them, until Ryan's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough for Emily to notice. "There it is," he said under his breath, his eyes scanning the screen. "An access point that should not be there." Emily's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" she asked, and Ryan turned the tablet slightly so she could see, pointing to a sequence of entries that looked ordinary at first glance, but repeated in a pattern that stood out once you knew where to look. "This access was routed through an internal account," he explained, "but the timing does not match normal activity. It is too precise, too clean, like someone wanted it to look routine." Emily followed his explanation, her mind connecting the pieces faster now. "So someone used an internal account to change the file," she said, and Ryan nodded. "Yes, but not just any account," he added, tapping the screen once more. "This level of access is restricted." Emily felt that familiar tension return, sharper this time. "Restricted to who?" she asked quietly, and Ryan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. Not because he did not know, but because he understood what it meant. "Executive-level permissions," he said. The words settled heavily between them, because they did not just point to a mistake or a misunderstanding. They pointed higher, much higher than Emily had initially considered, and as she leaned back slightly, absorbing what that meant, one thought became impossible to ignore. If the breach required that level of access, then whoever was behind it was either someone at the top or someone operating close enough to them to move unnoticed. Emily's gaze drifted for a moment, her thoughts returning again to Daniel Brooks, to his controlled reaction, his silence, the way he had not once questioned the accusation in front of everyone. And for the first time, the possibility she had tried to avoid became unavoidable. Either he was involved, or he was allowing something to happen for a reason she still did not understand. And as that realization settled in, it did not bring clarity, it brought a deeper question. Because if this was bigger than her, bigger than a single report or a single mistake, then whatever she had stepped into was not just about proving her innocence anymore. It was about uncovering something that someone with power had already decided needed to stay hidden. Emily Carter did not speak immediately after Ryan Mitchell said those words, because executive-level permissions changed everything in a way she could not ignore. And as she sat there in the quiet hum of the diner, the reality of what they had uncovered began to settle into something heavier, something far more deliberate than she had first imagined. This was no longer about a single altered report or a simple attempt to shift blame. This was structured, controlled, and protected by access that very few people in the company possessed, which meant whoever was behind it was either someone at the top or someone operating so close to that level that they could move without being questioned. Emily slowly folded her hands together on the table, her mind working through the possibilities, eliminating what did not fit, focusing only on what remained, because if she allowed emotion to take over now, she would miss something important. How many people have that level of access? She asked, her voice steady but lower than before. And Ryan leaned back slightly, considering the question before answering. Officially, a handful, he said, executive leadership, a few senior department heads, and of course, Daniel. He added, not emphasizing the name, but not avoiding it either. Emily nodded slowly, because that was exactly what she expected, but hearing it confirmed made the situation more real, more defined, and at the same time, more complicated. She looked down briefly at the table, then back up, her expression focused now. And if someone wanted to use that kind of access without being traced directly, she asked, and Ryan gave a small, almost reluctant nod. They would route it through another internal account, he said. Someone lower level, someone who would take the fall if anything surfaced. Emily felt a quiet tension rise in her chest again. Not panic, not anger, but recognition, because that was exactly what had happened to her. She was not just blamed, she was positioned, carefully, intentionally, placed in the exact spot where the evidence would point when the time came. So I was not random, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. And Ryan did not argue, because there was nothing to argue. The pattern was clear. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of that realization filling the space between them, until Emily finally broke the silence. There is something else, she said, her voice softer now, but carrying a different kind of certainty. Before all of this happened, I heard him say something. Ryan's gaze sharpened slightly. Who? He asked. And she met his eyes directly. Daniel, she replied. He said I was perfect for a plan. Ryan did not respond right away, but the shift in his expression was subtle and immediate. Not surprise exactly, but recognition of how that detail fit into everything else. And you think that plan is connected to this? He asked, and Emily nodded slowly. It has to be, she said. Nothing about this feels accidental. Ryan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice even more. Then there are two possibilities, he said. Either he is part of it, or he knows about it and is letting it play out. Emily held his gaze, because that was the question she had been avoiding, the one that carried the most weight. And for a moment, she allowed herself to consider both options fully. If Daniel Brooks was involved, then everything she believed about him, every decision she trusted, every opportunity he gave her, was part of something else entirely, something calculated. But if he was not, if he was aware of what was happening and chose not to stop it, then the reason had to be significant enough to justify what he had done to her. Emily exhaled slowly, her thoughts settling into something more defined. Because uncertainty was no longer useful, she needed direction, and that meant choosing what to believe, at least for now. He is not careless, she said finally, her voice firm. If he made a move like that in front of everyone, it was intentional. Ryan studied her for a moment, as if measuring whether she was following logic or instinct, and then nodded slightly. Then we need to figure out what he is waiting for, he said. Emily's eyes dropped briefly to the tablet still resting on the table, the logs, the access points, the patterns that had started to reveal something hidden beneath the surface. And then she looked back up, her expression sharper now, more certain than it had been since everything began. If this is a plan, she said quietly, then it is not over yet. And as those words settled between them, the realization that followed was impossible to ignore, because if the plan was still in motion, then whatever came next would not just expose the truth, it would force everyone involved to reveal exactly where they stood, including the one person she still did not fully understand, the one who had the power to end everything or let it unfold exactly as Intended. Emily Carter left the diner with a different kind of awareness, not the uncertainty that had followed her out of the office earlier, but something sharper, more controlled, because now she knew she was not dealing with a mistake. She was inside something that had been carefully designed, and whether she liked it or not, she was already part of it. The evening air felt cooler as she stepped outside, the sky beginning to dim into early night, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to think about her son, about the normal life she had been trying to protect, because everything she was about to do would put that stability at risk again. But walking away was no longer an option, not when the truth was this close. She glanced at her phone, checking the time, then looked back toward the direction of Brooks Industries, the glass building now reflecting the fading light, and one thought settled firmly in her mind. If this plan was still in motion, then the next move would happen soon, and she needed to be there to see it. "You are thinking of going back," Ryan Mitchell said quietly beside her, not as a question but as an observation, and Emily gave a small nod. "If something is about to happen, it will happen there," she replied, her voice steady, and Ryan studied her for a moment before responding. "Then you cannot just walk in," he said. "Your access is already revoked." Emily's expression did not change, because she had already considered that. "Then I do not walk in as myself," she said. And there was a brief silence as the meaning of that settled between them. Ryan exhaled slowly, then nodded once, not approving or disapproving, just accepting the direction they were heading. Within the hour, they were back near the building, but not at the front entrance. Instead, positioned across the street where they could observe without being noticed, the lobby lights still bright, employees moving in and out as the workday stretched into evening for those at higher levels. Emily watched carefully, her focus narrowing, because now every movement, every interaction could mean something. "There," Ryan said quietly, his voice low as he pointed subtly toward a side entrance, and Emily followed his gaze, her eyes landing on a familiar figure stepping out of a car. Someone from the executive floor, someone she had seen in meetings but never worked directly with. The recognition was immediate, and it matched the name she had written earlier, the one that did not fit. Emily felt a quiet confirmation settle in, not satisfaction, but clarity, because this was no longer theory, it was real. The man moved quickly, not rushing, but with purpose, his phone pressed to his ear as he entered the building through a secured access point. "That is your name," Ryan said under his breath, not needing to ask, and Emily nodded slightly, her eyes still fixed on the entrance. "He has access," she said, more to herself than to him. "And he has a reason." The question now was what that reason was, and how it connected to everything else. Minutes passed, the street growing quieter as the evening deepened, until something shifted inside the building, subtle at first, a change in movement, a shift in pace, people gathering in areas that had been empty moments before. Emily leaned forward slightly, her instincts sharpening, because this felt like the moment they had been waiting for. "Something is happening," she said quietly, and Ryan nodded, his attention focused just as intensely. Then the lights in one section of the upper floor flickered briefly before stabilizing. Not a failure, but a signal, something controlled, something intentional. Emily's pulse quickened, because whatever this was, it was not random. It was part of the same pattern they had been tracing all day. And then she saw him, Daniel Brooks, stepping into view on that same floor, his posture calm, his movements deliberate, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. He was not reacting, he was waiting. Emily felt that familiar tension return, but this time it came with understanding, because this confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Daniel was not caught off guard by any of this. He was part of the sequence, whether as the one controlling it or the one allowing it to unfold. "He knows," she said quietly, and Ryan did not argue, because the evidence was right in front of them. But then something else happened. Something that shifted the entire situation once again, because instead of moving to stop whatever was happening, Daniel stepped aside, not physically retreating, but creating space, as if he was making room for someone else to act. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, her focus locking onto that movement, because it was not hesitation, it was permission, and in that moment, the realization became unavoidable. This was not just about exposing a breach or finding the person responsible. This was about revealing them at the exact right time, in the exact right way, and everything that had happened to her, Every accusation, every public moment, had been part of setting that stage. But even with that understanding, one question remained, the one that mattered most. Because if Daniel had allowed all of this to happen, if he had let her take the fall in order to reach this moment, then there had to be a reason that justified that choice. A reason that was about to reveal itself whether she was ready for it or not. Emily Carter did not realize she had been holding her breath until Ryan Mitchell shifted slightly beside her, the quiet movement pulling her attention back to the present moment as the tension inside the building continued to build in ways that were no longer subtle. What had once been a normal work environment now felt staged, controlled, every movement carrying purpose. And as she watched the upper floor where Daniel Brooks stood, it became clear that whatever was about to happen had already been set in motion long before she was ever accused. "This is it," Ryan said quietly, his voice steady but focused, and Emily nodded without looking away, because she could feel it too. That sense of something reaching its final point, the moment where everything hidden would be forced into the open. Inside, the man they had identified earlier moved quickly across the executive floor, no longer on the phone, no longer blending into the background. His pace slightly faster now, his posture more rigid, as if he was aware of something changing but had not yet understood what it meant. Emily's eyes followed him carefully, her mind tracking every detail, every shift, because this was no longer about guessing. This was about witnessing. Then it happened, not with a loud interruption or a dramatic confrontation, but with something far more controlled, the kind of moment that only made sense once you saw the full picture. Security personnel began to appear at both ends of the hallway, not rushing, not alarming anyone, but positioning themselves with quiet precision, their presence subtle enough to avoid panic but clear enough to prevent movement. The man slowed, just slightly, his awareness catching up as he noticed what was happening around him, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his steps. Emily felt her pulse rise, because this was no coincidence. This was a coordinated action, and at the center of it all stood Daniel, watching, not intervening, not reacting, but allowing the moment to unfold exactly as planned. "He set this up," Emily said under her breath, the realization fully formed now, and Ryan gave a small nod. "Looks like it," he replied, his eyes still fixed on the scene. Inside, the man turned slightly, his gaze moving from one security officer to another, the calm confidence he carried earlier beginning to shift into something more uncertain, and that was when felt a strange mix of emotions rise within her, not relief, not anger, but something more complex, because the truth she had been searching for was finally revealing itself. But it came with a cost she could not ignore, the cost of being used, of being placed in a position where her trust had been broken in order to make this moment possible. And as she watched Daniel stand there, orchestrating the final steps of a plan that had required her to fall first, one question remained, the only question that mattered now, because understanding the truth did not erase what she had felt, it only changed how she saw it. And as the scene inside reached its quiet conclusion, Emily Carter realized that the next moment would not be about what Daniel had done, it would be about why he chose to do it this way. And whether that reason was something she could ever accept. Emily Carter did not move right away as the tension inside the building slowly dissolved into something quieter, more controlled. Because even though the moment of exposure had passed, the weight of everything she had just witnessed was only beginning to settle. The man they had identified was no longer moving freely, his confidence replaced by a stillness that spoke louder than any words, and Daniel Brooks stood just a few steps away, calm as ever, but no longer distant in the same way. Because now it was clear that every action he had taken had been leading to this exact point. "It is over," Ryan Mitchell said quietly beside her, but Emily did not respond, her eyes still fixed on the scene, because for her, this was not the end. It was the answer to a question she had been forced to carry since the moment she was escorted out of that same building. Slowly, she stepped back from the glass, her thoughts moving through everything that had happened, from the accusation to the investigation, from the doubt to the realization. And as the pieces aligned, one truth became impossible to ignore. Daniel had known from the beginning that something was wrong, but instead of stopping it immediately, he had allowed it to unfold, carefully, deliberately, using her position to draw out the person responsible. Emily exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in understanding, because now she saw the full picture. The altered files, the access logs, the timing, all of it had been part of a larger strategy, one that required absolute certainty before acting. He needed proof, she said softly, more to herself than to Ryan, and he nodded. At that level, suspicion is not enough, he replied. He had to be sure. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting that sink in, because while it explained everything, it did not erase what it had cost her. She had been accused, publicly, her trust broken in front of everyone she worked with, her reputation placed at risk, and all of it had been necessary for this outcome to happen exactly as it did. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze shifted back to the building, just in time to see Daniel turning away from the scene, his role in that moment complete, his expression unreadable as always, but now carrying something else beneath the surface, something that had been hidden until now. And then, as if he sensed it, his eyes lifted slightly, not scanning the room, not searching randomly, but looking outward, toward the street, toward where she stood. Emily felt her breath catch for just a second, because even from that distance, the connection was unmistakable. He knew she was there, or at least he knew she would be. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The space between them filled with everything that had not been said, everything that could not be explained in a single moment. Ryan shifted slightly, breaking the stillness just enough to ground her. "So what now?" he asked, and Emily looked away from the building. Her thoughts no longer scattered but focused in a way they had not been before, because the uncertainty that once defined this situation had been replaced by something clearer, more difficult, but also more honest. "Now," she said slowly, "I find out why he did not tell me." And as those words left her, she realized that was the only question that still mattered, not what happened, not how it happened, but why he chose to let her go through it without giving her the truth. Because understanding the plan did not mean accepting it, and knowing the reason did not mean it would be enough. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone once more, her reflection faintly visible again on the screen, but this time her expression was different, not uncertain, not overwhelmed, but steady, because whatever came next would not be about proving anything anymore. It would be about confronting the one person who had changed everything, not just her job, but her sense of trust itself. Behind her, the city continued moving, unaware of what had just unfolded, unaware of the quiet decisions and calculated risks that had led to this moment. But for Emily Carter, everything had shifted, and as she stood there, just outside the place where she had lost everything and gained the truth at the same time, she understood one final thing. The story was not finished yet, because the most important conversation had not even begun, and when it did, it would determine whether what Daniel Brooks had done was something she could ever forgive, or something that would change how she saw him forever.